Welcome to episode 37 of the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. Today, we have a great topic of focus for you, which is the excellent topic of magic muscles. Magic muscles. And this may be kind of a new term to you. Like, what's a magic muscle? And we're, of course, going to dive into what a magic muscle is and define it as we get talking today. But just to throw out like a brief, maybe superficial definition to give you an idea of what this is all about, there tend to be kind of like a select few muscles in the human body that tend to be kind of pulled out and given a little extra attention, extra focus, maybe treated as though they're more special or that they matter more than other muscles in the human body. So those we can kind of casually think of them as quote magic muscles. And it's just interesting because the human body contains well over 600 muscles. That's a lot of individual muscles in the body, but we tend to hear about, I'm going to say, as far as magic muscles go, maybe the list is somewhere around 10-ish. Kind of depends on exactly which ones, but we tend to hear a lot about 10 or so muscles, like in terms of in the yoga movement world, in the fitness worlds, in the rehab world, and also just kind of on social media when you're scrolling around out there or on Google. They're just this handful of muscles that get pulled out and treated as extra important or extra magical. And so that is what we wanted to focus on today. And a couple questions like, is it helpful to have a focus on magic muscles? And in some contexts, it may be like there may be good reason to treat certain muscles as mattering more than others. But also in other contexts, could it be unhelpful to have this kind of overly specific anatomical focus on the muscles? So that's basically what we're looking at today. Oh, and just to throw out a few examples that I have a feeling many of our listeners will be able to relate to as far as kind of what Travis and I are calling magic muscles today. A few examples might be transverse abdominus, which is like this deep abdominal muscle that tends to get a lot of attention. The psoas muscle, a muscle in your low back called the quadratus lumborum, but also just called the QL muscle. And if you're not familiar with any of those, we will be defining them today as we discuss. So just so you know, but if I'm kind of mentioning those muscles, they may kind of ring a bell for you. Like you might be thinking like, oh, I've definitely heard about those muscles, or I see talk about those muscles. They tend to be kind of buzz termy muscles. So that's what we mean by magic muscles. And our plan for today is we want to kind of start off by just talking about the concept of magic muscles in general and some foundational ideas that surround them. And the idea, like maybe the pluses and minuses of a movement cueing or a movement practicing approach that's like from a muscle-based perspective. So we kind of want to talk about some general ideas surrounding this topic, and then we plan to move into looking a little more deeply into some specific magic muscles to give them a little more attention and just for some more learning opportunity, because when we look at examples, that can help us see how they show up for us out there in the world of movement. So that's our plan. And the hope is that we get to kind of geek out on anatomy in this episode. We know that a lot of our community consists of yoga and movement geekily minded people, and Travis and I are also geekily minded. So we hope to, yeah, just like geek out on some anatomy in this conversation and also just to kind of hone all of our critical thinking skills a bit more, as we always attempt to do throughout like all of our Travis's and my work together in general and all the episodes of the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. Before we dive into our content, just a few reminders about some ways that you can support us and our work with this podcast. Number one is this is kind of new, but you can now support us and the work and the effort and the time that we put into this podcast and the educational resource that it serves. You can support us by becoming a monthly supporter for just $3 a month. So that's kind of cool. If you've been finding our offering here to be of value, you could offer some value back to help support us. and to help, the good word of like an evidence-based approach to yoga and movement to help that spread in our community. So the link to become a supporter is in the show notes. And you could find that in the show notes on all of our episodes. Become a supporter of the Yoga Meets Movement Science podcast. In addition, you can also support us by subscribing to this podcast, leaving us a rating or a review. You can also sign up for my email newsletter to just stay on top of everything going on around here with Travis and me and all this content. And you could do that at jennirawlings.com/newsletter. And lastly, you can support us by considering joining Travis's and my Strength for Yoga remote group training, which is a very cool strength program we created to help specifically yoga practitioners bring strength into their movement practice, bring strength training into their movement practice. So you can use code podcast30 for 30% off your first month in our remote group training program. And the link is in the show notes, and you could find out more at jennirawlings.com. So now that all of that is said, we are ready to turn our attention to the great topic of magic muscles. And Travis, I know in this intro, I kind of threw out like sort of a definition for magic muscles, but like in your words or in your sense of the term, like what's a magic muscle?
Ooh, it's like when the magician has the hat and he pulls the rabbit out of it,
Oh
right?
my gosh.
So
Mm-hmm.
I I
Mm-hmm.
think that it's just a muscle that is extra special, like more special than all
Yeah.
the others, and deserves extra special attention. And if we give it the extra special attention, then it'll cure us of all that ails us, right? So whether it's a
Right.
pain thing or a performance thing or uh like you're trying to achieve a pose or
Yeah.
just trying to fine tune something, if you can just get your insert magic muscle to fire properly or
Yes.
sequence better because it's
Yes.
off or any of those ideas, then magically your whatever ails you will be fixed.
I really love that definition. Yeah, that I really resonate with that as well. It's kind of in my impression, it's kind of like these specific muscles get elevated and I guess kind of thrown out at you as like, you need to pay attention to this muscle. Because if you're
Mm-hmm.
not, you're being held back. Like you said, something that ails you, whether it's a painful condition or a performance issue. Maybe you don't run as fast. Maybe you don't lift as much. Maybe you don't get into that yoga
Mm-hmm.
pose. Something like that, right?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, so it's just kind of yeah, it's like you, the general person, you need to pay attention to this muscle because of this, and it's going to fix this for you, right?
You're right. And you, the general person, like we've talked about this before, like with the breathing episode, which was episode number, I don't know,
35, I'm pretty sure.
35.
Oh
Yeah.
wait, you mean
So,
breathing with Joe Miller or nasal breathing?
uh,
We did
whichever
two
one,
breathing.
I think it was the nasal breathing where it was like, you, the general
Oh
person, you're breathing
yes,
wrong. You, the general, like everybody's TA is not firing.
100%.
Everybody's
Oh,
glutes are
TA
not
is
working.
transverse abdominus, just so people know, in case they didn't know. TA,
Yeah.
right?
So it,
That's
it
right.
it's indiscriminately applied, which I think we'll
Thank you.
probably get
Yes,
into. It's like, well,
indiscriminately applied.
not everybody has a problem with the same muscle, right? Or even everybody with a
Absolutely.
certain painful condition necessarily has a problem with the same muscle. So it's like an easy solution to a complex problem. And it's
Right.
just uniformly everybody needs this.
Oh my gosh. Thanks for drawing that parallel with like what we talked about in the nasal breathing episode. And yeah, just to affirm that was episode 35 for anyone who
Yeah,
wants to go
right.
dive in.
So everybody's breathing wrong and everybody's transverse abdominus is not working.
Exactly. And therefore we all need to learn from like our yoga teacher or from our physical therapist. Like we need to learn this transverse abdominus activation drill or
Hmm.
exercise, right? Like this is just an example. And we're planning to talk about that.
Yeah, we'll insert other muscle and it's all the same.
Right.
Activation, contraction, timing, sequencing.
All of that. And it does seem like you alluded to this a little bit ago, but it's kind of just like an oversimplification of, maybe how the body works, how pain works, how performance, interplays
Yeah.
with all of that.
It's like everybody wants a quick fix, right?
Yeah.
So a pill that you can take that'll fix whatever the problem is. And this is like a magic pill. This is like the magic muscle. This one thing, work
Yeah.
on this, and then your problem will be solved.
100%. Yeah, I really feel like that's how it's treated. And it's just so interesting to me because when you study anatomy, you learn, like I said in the intro, but like there are, I read when I was doing some research, specifically 639 muscles in the human body. But I think sometimes different sources say a different number. So generally just
Mm-hmm.
over 600. But that's a lot of muscles, that like we could be talking about and thinking about. So it's just, why is it that just this like small handful tend to be like kind of pulled out and held up like in,
Yeah. Well,
buzz terms, trendy topics, just they catch
and
on.
it's interesting, like why these eight or seven muscles that we're going to talk about, and
Yeah, we're
not,
planning to try to talk about seven today, but yeah.
yeah, and not the other 632,
Yeah.
right? Like what? And I
Yeah.
think maybe we will talk about what's particularly attractive about these seven muscles, and kind of ties
Yeah.
them together, or some
Yeah.
unifying themes about them that make them appear magical, where the other 632, like, nobody cares about them.
Yeah, and actually I do have some ideas about like what they have in common, like why these specific muscles tend to become. And yeah, so we might talk about that kind of as we wrap up at the end after we kind of go through all of
So you
these.
listen till the end to find out.
Exactly. You've got to find out like what we think about at least why these muscles, how they become magical. And then we also, of course, wanted to point out, as with everything we talk about on the podcast, nothing's black or white. It's always nuanced. So Travis and I think I could speak for Travis in suggesting that we're certainly not here to say that we should never talk about muscles or think about movement from a muscle-based, perspective. And I
Hmm.
think there are a lot of contexts in which, maybe it's not magic muscles, but maybe just like thinking about muscles and placing priority on them and using them in your language. I think there are some context in which that matters and is actually helpful, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
Like strength training, I feel like is one example, or even maybe more specifically than strength training, like bodybuilding, which is a type of strength training that's focused on hypertrophy, which is a fancy word for like muscle growth.
Right.
And in that community, I guess you could say community, but in that practice of
Hmm.
bodybuilding,
Yeah.
they're certainly like they're really trying to train certain muscles, right? Like,
Yeah.
and
It's a look that you're after. It's an aesthetic.
right, that's
So
right.
you're constantly striving, not just for bigger muscles, that's certainly part of it, but for more symmetry and balance. And you're,
Mhm.
whether that's you looking at yourself in the mirror, or pictures of you, or videos of you, or your bodybuilding coach, and if they identify, oh, this side or this muscle is underdeveloped relative to the other muscles, then they
Right.
specifically try to work on bringing that muscle up relative to what else you got going on. So
Right.
clearly a
To
muscular
find that
approach, although
symmetry.
in a bodybuilding context they're usually addressing more prime movers, like bigger muscles.
Mhm,
um
mhm. It's not
then
all 600 muscles, right? Like, they
Well,
don't
no,
trace.
but like you wouldn't hear the a bodybuilder talking about, like, well, I really need to grow my TA. I really need to grow my QL. Like, they're
Right?
talking about pecs and biceps and
That's
lats,
right.
which aren't.
Quads,
There's a
maybe.
If you drew a Venn diagram of the magic muscles and the muscles that bodybuilders are targeting, there's no overlap.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a really funny point. Yeah, they're not trying to grow their psoas.
Right.
Or yeah, most likely not.
Yeah.
Right, so that's an
There's one
interesting.
exception. There's one exception.
What
Uh,
is it?
I don't. Should we spoil it now?
Yeah, we could,
The
yeah.
the muscle that's on both lists would be the glutes.
Oh, right, right, right. Bodybuilders do try to focus on their glutes, yeah. Right, but anyway, so just this example, like bodybuilders pointing them out that, it's not necessarily the same as the quote "magic muscles," but there's some overlap just in this idea of, in general, thinking about movement and taking an approach that's very muscular based, basically. So it's got overlap with our idea of the magic muscles, but it's a little bit different, but related. And I think we did kind of want to talk about, like, in my mind, thinking of bodybuilding being that's very a muscle approach, but then strength training, which I know again there's overlap there. Like you're training strength when you're bodybuilding, but it's a little different. But
Hmm.
just
Hmm.
general strength training, there does seem to be a distinction there where there's often advocated this approach where you strength train movements, not muscles, right, Travis?
Hmm.
That's like a thing in strength training, right? That some people at least advocate for.
Yes, that is true. So when we say movement patterns, we're talking about training like
Hmm.
focusing your training or conceptualizing your training more around movement patterns like squats and hip hinges and upper body pushing and pulling and
Hmm.
lunging and twisting and locomotion. Those are kind of the ones that I think of that different people will categorize them in different ways. Like some people will call lump lunges and squats into level changes, which is like an even more
Oh, yeah.
more abstract kind of
That
thought
is pretty
process.
abstract.
But
Yeah.
yeah, like there's no muscles in any of those descriptors.
Right. Right. It's like more of a focus on the movement pattern, and then just whichever muscles need to work in order to achieve that movement pattern,
Right.
they'll just work. But you don't need to focus so much on you are
Hmm.
firing this muscle. It's just like you're doing a squat, and everything that's working is what's working, right?
Right. And then the idea behind that is that as long as you're addressing all of those major movement patterns, you will
Mm-hmm.
automatically work all of the muscles, which I
Mm-hmm.
think I think that's a reasonable take. I
Mm-hmm.
also think that there might be some muscles, none of the magic muscles necessarily, or maybe some, but that don't get worked quite to the degree that I would like with just like those full body movement pattern approaches. I'm talking about
Mm-hmm.
things like the the hip rotators
Mm-hmm.
or like the basically anything in the frontal or transverse plane, like frontal moving side to side and transverse being rotation. Although I,
Mm-hmm.
depending on how you categorize things, sometimes like twisting or rotating movements are included as a movement category. But like you'd have to go out of your way to like you'd have to do lateral lunges to make sure
Right.
that
Right.
you're incorporating something in the frontal plane, just
Yeah.
because most of those pushing, pulling, hinging, bridging is occurring in the sagittal plane. And if you
That
only
totally makes
work in the
sense.
sagittal plane, then there are muscles that you're not quite hitting as deliberately as you could if you took a movement and muscle approach.
Exactly. So it's a good example of maybe where, yeah, taking that muscle approach could help. It could help, like, maybe fill in some gaps where
Yeah,
taking just a movement pattern approach could get, I don't know, 90%. I don't know what percent you would suggest, but
yeah, yeah,
gets a
yeah.
lot done. But maybe you also need to fill in a little bit if you truly want that, like, complete targeting of
Right.
everything.
I think
Right.
so, and I also think like I we talked about this in my exercise prescription course a couple weeks ago, and
Yes.
I just made up numbers, but it was like if you only have 20 minutes for your
Hmm.
strength practice, you could probably just focus on those major movement patterns. But if you
Right.
had 30 minutes, then maybe you focus on mostly major movement patterns and then sprinkle in a couple of the more muscle based
Yeah.
additions. And then if you had an hour, then still focus mostly on the movement patterns, but now you have a little extra time to add some muscle like specific, more nitty gritty things. But
Yeah.
main,
Yeah.
if you take that hour and you flipped it and you did 80% working your magic muscles, and then
Yeah.
20% of like squatting, deadlifting, pushing, pulling,
Hmm.
you're not getting as much bang for your buck as you could.
That totally makes sense. Yeah, so that's like kind of one way we could conceptualize of like a movement-based approach or a movement pattern-based approach versus a muscle-based
Hmm.
approach. in like a training, a strength training context. And we could
Mm-hmm.
also think about it in more terms of like a yoga slash movement context where it's not so much strength training, but it's yoga. And in a yoga in a yoga
So how do
context,
you explain that besides it's yoga?
I know. I was hesitating there because you and I have talked so much about like, is there strength training? Like, does yoga strengthen you? And we
Right,
just, it's
right.
like a whole topic that
I know,
it's not
yeah.
to say that there's not strength in yoga, but it's not the same thing as strength training. And maybe we can
Mm-hmm.
refer people to episode 6, where we talked about, I think the title's like, is Ashtanga yoga a cult? And the value of strength is kind of a random title. But episode 6, we actually go into that in a lot of depth, and we've talked about it all throughout our work
Yeah.
together. But that's why was hesitating there. Yeah, you can get
Right.
some strength in yoga, but
Yeah.
it's not going to be the same.
We know what yoga does and
Right,
is.
right. We all know. We in our whole audience, we know our yoga practice, and so it's distinct from something where maybe you're targeting your body for well-rounded strength all the way around in this progressive way. But when it comes to yoga and leading people through a yoga practice or just movement in general, you can also think about like taking a movement versus a muscle-based approach
Mm-hmm.
there. And I tend to see a lot of advocacy for taking the movement-based approach versus the muscle-based approach. Like, can you lead people through movement in a way that more just directs just the movement, and then the muscles that need to fire, your nervous system's automatically going to fire them, rather than maybe micromanaging which specific muscles they're using.
Do you think that yoga practice is better, not better suited, but more naturally lends itself to a movement approach because the names of the poses are don't have muscles in them?
That's a really good. I've never. You mean because like in a strength training context, a lot of the names do have
Chest
muscles?
press. Yeah, shoulder press.
Yeah, although those are areas of the body and not so much muscles, right? Those exercise
mm,
names.
yeah, well, right, because they don't call it like deltoid press.
Yeah, or pec
Yeah.
press.
They call it pec fly though. You could call it chest
That's
fly
true.
or pec fly.
That's true. Oh,
Rear
bicep
delt
curls.
raise. Right. Yeah, so
Yeah. So
oftentimes
yeah,
there are.
that's a really good point. Yeah, because we certainly like in our yoga pose names, whether we use like the Sanskrit name or the English name, they're not muscle based names. So I could certainly see that. I think that's a really good question. But just to give people a bit of a clearer idea like an example of what I mean with like movement versus muscle based cueing in a yoga context. Like one
Hmm.
example is, say you're standing in like Tadasana mountain pose and you just bring one knee up to your chest. So you're basically moving that hip into hip flexion, we would call that direction of
Hmm.
movement. So you could, and I've certainly seen this done. You could teach that movement where you cue something like, use your psoas muscle, because that's one of your hip flexors. And I've certainly heard this partly because psoas is a magic
Seriously?
muscle. Yes, use your psoas muscle to draw your knee up to your chest. And so it's then like
Preposterous.
asking people to isolate, like, we have multiple hip flexors. We have multiple
Hmm.
muscles that cross the joint that can do similar things, but you're asking people to try to isolate one, which they can't even do realistically anyway. Like, you
No,
can't isolate a muscle or even, it's just, yeah. So it's just confusing. It can kind of, trip people up. It can make the movement maybe a little less efficient versus simply saying, lift your knee to your chest, and then the muscles that need to work will just fire
I can't
automatically.
believe.
Yeah, they do. They do. And again, like I said, I think it's specifically the psoas because it's like a extra popular muscle, but also transverse abdominis TVA is very commonly cued in yoga, like especially the cue navel to spine, which is
Yeah,
like intending to, whether they say that muscle name or whether they're intending to get the specific muscle to fire.
yeah. That one at
It's
least makes
similar.
more sense because that's the muscle that does that. But the psoas, yeah. Either way, it's going to be all of the muscles, not
Yeah, exactly.
just because you are. I'm thinking of my psoas. I'm thinking of my psoas as I bring my knee up. Like that's really going to do anything.
Yes, and doesn't maybe just interfere with what otherwise might be like smoother, more just automatic movement, you know?
Yeah.
So that's why sometimes it's taught in certain yoga teacher trainings to just, cue movement as movement. And maybe that entails you understanding the different directions of movement in the body so that you can, either use like you could use like hip flexion, or you could just, draw your knee up, crease at the front of your hip, like try to use language that creates these actions without necessarily making it so, kind of micromanaging muscle based. There's another
Mhm.
great tip that I've heard before that I try to embody in the way that I teach movement is teaching movement from the bones rather than from the muscles.
Mhm.
Have you heard of that before, Travis, that distinction?
Only from you, but
Yeah,
I'm
I think
still
I remember when
fuzzy
you
still fuzzy on it. So, like, what would you say to instead of flex your hip, what would you say?
I would actually just be it would just be again, draw the knee up toward it would be the same, but it's like you're
Okay.
asking a better for me, a better example of that, I think of when I think of like pelvis movement. So, you can
Mhm.
move your pelvis in many different ways. And say perchance you wanted to instruct your students to like posteriorly tilt their pelvis or tuck their pelvis. That's like another word for it.
Mhm. Mhm.
You could, and again, it's going to depend on the like if we're talking strength training, maybe it's a little different. But in a yoga context, you could suggest that people, I don't know, like lift their belly or lift their abdominals in order to pull the pelvis under, or squeeze their glutes in order to do that. Those would be like muscle based cues. Or you could cue something like lift your two frontal hip points, which is those are like your anterior
Mm.
superior iliac spine, or lift your pubic bone, or lengthen your tailbone down, in which case you're actually cueing the movement of the actual bones. And then
Got
people
it.
don't have to like think about, well, which muscles should I engage, the abdominals in the front or the glutes in the back? Like which should I? It's just maybe don't think about that. Just think about tilt your pelvis, which is that's moving the bones, and the
That's
muscles
cool.
that your nervous system wants to fire will fire. So it's just a way of kind of simplifying. Does that make sense? And the hip flexion example, if you're standing and if I cued knee to chest, that's also movement from the bone, but that's not so distinct from the original example that I was giving, which was just movement
Yeah.
versus muscle.
Yeah.
So it's just another
Well,
way to think
especially
about it.
when you're talking about pelvic motion where that can happen, like you said, through the abdominals or through the glutes. And then but you don't have to over specify.
Yeah, exactly. And you could really apply that to so many joint actions all throughout the body. And
Mhm.
just kind of maybe just learn the directions of movement, and then your teaching language may just kind of naturally arise to where you just cue around those directions and the movement of the bones and things that get everything to happen without being so muscle based. But I did
Mhm.
want to, of course, point out that, and again, it's always nuanced, but that it's not like I'm suggesting that we should never talk about muscles in yoga. There's a
Mhm.
difference between directing movement from the muscles versus just maybe asking people to bring their attention to a muscle as an area of the body to notice like how it feels, like maybe in a hamstring stretch. Like we all know the hamstrings are the muscles along the back of the thigh. I'm totally not saying we shouldn't ever talk about the hamstrings in yoga. You might say like, what do you feel in your hamstrings? But that's a little different. That's more like on the sensation side. What do you feel, what do you notice, what do you observe? And that's different than like actually directing movement, which is more on like the motor or the movement side. Does that
Mhm.
distinction sort of make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah. So again, it's never black or white. It's not to say, it's fine. There are a lot of reasons why we might want to talk about muscles and cue movement. Not maybe not cue movement. Sorry, but in the yoga context, talk about muscles is like they help you locate areas of the body, but
Do
maybe not so much in directing movement. Maybe we should shift our attention to looking at some magic muscles and
Mhm.
just taking a little deeper dive into them for the purposes of, learning more about the body and movement, but also looking at these examples and seeing like maybe these muscles have been extra emphasized and treated in an extra specific way. And
Mhm.
could this just kind of maybe help us see where maybe that is helpful and maybe where it's not so helpful? And like, what does research suggest about these things?
Mhm.
So this discussion of the magic muscles we want to touch on, it's certainly relevant for our yoga teaching and practice. And also in strength training, we're kind of looking at these three potential contexts here, and also like rehab. So yeah, this next kind of conversation will maybe touch on all three of those realms and isn't so much just focused on whether we got like direct movement from the muscles, but it's more just about highlighting and pulling out specific muscles
Hmm.
as extra important. So, our first magic muscle on the list that we wanted to talk about today is one I mentioned in the intro, which is this muscle in the low back called the quadratus lumborum, or you might hear it called the QL. And Travis, I'm sure you're familiar with the QL muscle, right?
I am. Is it the muscle that assists the hip abductors on the opposite side? Do
That's
you
a
know?
really good
Well, let me
question.
start over. Do you know what the joint action of the QL is?
Well, that's a really good question because we often learn joint actions for the QL in our anatomy
Hmm.
textbooks and in anatomy classes. But actually, scientific research doesn't actually really know exactly what the QL does. And
That's why
according
it's
to the
magic.
research, exact. Okay, well, actually, maybe first we might want to point out why this muscle is a magic muscle. And in
Okay.
my experience, at least, it's usually because it's often blamed for low back pain.
Right.
I don't know if you've experienced that, but I see
Hmm.
that like all the
Hmm.
time. Like,
Hmm.
yeah, if you have pain in your low back, you very likely may have like a quote tight QL or just something about your QL is what's
An
creating
overactive QL.
an overactive QL. Exactly. You need to
A
relax
tonic
or
QL. Nobody uses that
yeah,
anymore. But
I
you've
feel like
ever
I
heard
don't
that
hear that.
before? Like
Tonic
tonic
versus
and
phasic.
phasic.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I have. I don't think I've heard the QL in in
No, I don't know.
reference to those
It's just
terms,
another
but
word.
for like
Another.
overactive or whatever.
Yeah. Whatever that means.
Um, yeah, I know, right? But yeah, so just all these ideas, and I tend to see even in a yoga so like, yoga is not rehab. It's like a different context from rehab. But as we sometimes talk about on this podcast, sometimes there are these like blurred lines or gray areas where sometimes teachers bring in things to treat the body for pain into a yoga practice, and maybe we can have a separate conversation about whether that's stepping outside of one's lane and whether that's within a yoga
Mm.
teacher's scope of practice. That's maybe not what we're talking about today, but I certainly hear yoga teachers teach like we are stretching the QL and that's going to make our back feel better, or we're going to roll the QL out with like therapy balls, like balls, and
Mm.
roll on them, like
Release the QL.
release the QL. Yeah, for sure, for sure. For sure. So these are some examples to show like how it's propped up as a magic muscle, right?
Right. Right.
Right. So that's kind of the language that you tend to hear about the quadratus lumborum. So I mentioned that it's in the low back, but maybe we should just be a little more specific so people have a better idea in case you hadn't learned about this muscle before. It's in
Hmm.
the low back. It's a relatively deep low back muscle, and it runs from your 12th rib down to the top of your pelvis or the iliac crest. And you have one on either side, as we do with just about all of our muscles, like one on either side. So, because of its location, we have historically been taught or heard that the QL does side bending or like hip hike,
Right.
like lifts
So
the hip on one side.
hip hiking would be the what I was referring to
It would
with
be,
the
yeah, I
assisting
believe so.
abduction, and it's on the opposite side, right?
Right. That would be
So it
what people
hikes
would
the right
say.
hip up in support of the left hip abductor, theoretically.
Yeah, like it would work like in synergy or something.
Yeah.
Yeah, in theory, that's like certainly what you would learn about it. It's involved in hip hiking and side bending. And also, if they both of them fire at the same time, it's supposed to be involved in extending the low back,
Yeah.
spinal extension.
Yeah.
So these are the things that you learn about it. And because of all of that, it's so low back surrounded and it's supposed to like act on the low back. That's partly why I think it's connected to like why people say it's connected to low back pain because it's
Hmm.
right there, like on
It's in
the
the
lumbar
spot.
spine. Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
it runs right along your lumbar spine.
It
So it
hurts right here.
actually, right. So it seems like you're
Oh,
pointing
that's your
to it, right?
QL. Yeah.
Exactly. But first of all, and this is a common theme that we'll run through all these magic muscles, but we definitely tend to have like a musculoskeletal bias in terms of when we're naming a structure for pain or naming any
Hmm.
source of pain. It's just really easy to be like, well, what muscle is it? But sometimes we maybe forget that we have all these other tissues and structures in the body beyond just like muscles, like including blood vessels and nerves and fascia and lymph and just all this other stuff. And we know, and we've talked a ton on this podcast about how pain is a biopsychosocial phenomenon anyway. It's not always just the bio or just like your actual, like the physical tissues. It could be bio in terms of it being something more systemic, and just like more physiological, like inflammation or something, or it could be psycho, it could be social, it could be related to beliefs that you have, or um, influences from society and people that you know and what people tell you about the body. So
Yeah.
anyway, pain is
And
complex.
maybe more likely the combination of all three.
Right, exactly. Like, yes, it's rarely, if ever, just like one single thing. So to even say and throw out to just the general public, like, oh, you have low back pain, it's got to be your QL.
Hmm.
Like that's one of those indiscriminate recommendations, right? Like you talked about toward the beginning.
Right.
Um, I think too, when we're thinking about low back pain, I heard this really great podcast interview with Peter O'Sullivan. I'm sure you know who he
Mm-hmm.
is,
Mm-hmm.
physical therapist and researcher. And he was just talking about how when we have like a headache, when we have a headache, we don't ever think that the reason we have a headache is because you like just banged your head and that you like cause like physical, like to the bio, like you banged your head and that's why you have a headache. We're always like, oh, I didn't sleep well, or I didn't have my caffeine, or I'm stressed.
Oh
We
wow.
tend to just default to that for a headache. And
Yeah.
he was just suggesting it's the same, well, really with the whole rest of the body, but he was specifically talking about the low
Oh,
back.
I love that.
Right? Like, why do we always default to like it has to be something structural in the back? Like, couldn't it just be I had a stressful day? I wasn't sleeping well this week. Like why don't we default to those more other types
Mm-hmm.
of answers? Why do we always want to point to structure? But with our head, with a headache, we're never like, oh, I fell and banged my head and that's why I have a headache. Unless you literally did fall and bang your
Right,
head, but
right, right, right.
that's like 0.001% of headaches.
Yeah.
So
Or unless you busted up your back doing something
yes,
where
Travis,
then it makes
totally.
sense. But it's like, oh, my
You're
back
so right.
aches today. And you go right to the QL.
Exactly.
Or your provider does.
Or your provider does, or your yoga teacher does if they're teaching you, you've got a tight QL. And then there's also the other
Everybody in the
side.
room.
Yeah. It also could be too, if it's not a yoga teacher saying you have low back pain, this is why, let's roll it out. There's also a lot of language around like if you have a tight QL, it's going to cause you back pain if it doesn't already.
Ooh,
So these language
that's
around these magic muscles
dangerous.
that like, yeah, that like, well, maybe you don't have the pain now, but you're going to unless you do what
Yeah.
I tell you
We
need to
better roll
do.
this out to prevent your low back pain.
Yeah,
Which is
exactly.
wrong in so many ways.
Exactly. So let's just finish talking about the QL. So here's the thing about the quadratus lumborum that I discovered upon some research about this muscle, which is that although we tend to hear in our anatomy books that it does those actions we spoke about, actually it's actually not really known what its actual actions are. And there was this awesome study done, Phillips et al. 2008, where they actually looked at cadavers and they looked at like the fascicle angles of the QL and they did all these measurements and they discovered that at most the quadratus lumborum contributes at most 10% to side bending, which is lateral flexion, or
Mhm.
to spinal extension, which is back bending. And in comparison to erector spinae and multifidus, which are two other, and especially erector spinae, they're more superficial, and that's a much bigger muscle complex in the all the way up and down the spine, but in the low back. So this research was just like the QL like hardly acts on the lumbar spine at all. It's at
Wow.
most 10% compared to erector spinae and multifidus, but we don't hear erector spinae, at least
Not
not far,
Yeah,
not
not the
nearly as often,
erectors.
right? Yeah,
Multifidus. That could
right.
be
Which
another magic
that's a
muscle.
magic muscle that's not on our list, but yeah.
Yeah.
So anyway,
That's
they were
funny.
just like at most, it's like they were just suggesting we don't really know what it does.
Hmm.
And then I did see, so someone you and I've talked about before, Travis Rich Severin, he's PhD physiotherapist and he's a cardiopulmonary specialist. So he knows a lot about like breathing and the breath. I've interviewed him for my blog before. And I just had remembered a few years ago, he put something out on social media questioning all the focus on the QL. And he suggested, based on what he knew of breathing in the body, that the QL's actual job is not lateral flexion and hip hiking and spinal extension, but its job is actually to stabilize the 12th rib on the inhale or on
Hmm.
inspiration. Like it just plays a role. It's like a breathing muscle to keep like the rib cage down or the bottom rib down as you inhale. Oh, and the other thing about the QL, sorry, I should have said this from the very beginning because we're about to move on. But the other thing about the QL is that it's actually cross sectionally, it's very small. It's like a very thin muscle. And that's what the
And it's
researchers were reporting.
quadrangle shaped, right? That's why it's called
Yeah.
quadratus.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, exactly.
it's all coming
Yeah,
back to me.
yeah, totally. So it's just like not even a very thick or big muscle. It does span from the bottom rib down to the pelvis, but as far as muscle thickness wise, it's not even like a very thick. It's like very
Not
small.
like our other magic muscles.
Yeah, right, right, right. But just to treat it as though it's playing this huge role,
Right.
whether it's
So
pain
the magic
or
muscle in this case should really be the erectors.
yeah, I think in this case, yeah. Not that we're advocating for
Let's give a
magic
substitute for all
muscles.
7 muscles.
We could we'll see if we can. Do you think we covered QL well enough right now to move on to our next? Because we've got a few more to talk about. But
Yeah,
just
let's
is
do it.
just yeah, the point is like, do we need to be pulling that muscle out and highlighting it? Maybe in some very specific, probably pretty rare instances, maybe, but that's not really the context of like a yoga movement class.
Right.
To be pulling, needing to make a big deal out of this magic muscle.
Hmm.
So our next muscle on the list, and I'm sure Travis, you've heard about this one.
This is like an age-old one.
It's an age-old one. What is it? Will you tell us what it is?
The next magic muscle is the VMO or vastus medialis obliquus, which is one of
That's
our
right.
4 quadriceps muscles.
Totally.
And vastus medialis indicates that it is medial, so it's on the
Yeah,
inner, not inner thigh, because that's where the adductors are, but it's
right.
more inner than outer.
Exactly. So your quads, just in case people don't know, like what are the
Yeah.
quads?
Oh yeah. So the quads are the muscles, the 4 muscles, quads,
Hmm.
on the
Yeah.
fronts of the thighs that extend the knee, and
Yeah,
then the rectus femoris, the most superficial one, also flexes the hip, as we
that's right.
alluded to earlier. But
Right.
primarily, when people think about them, these are the knee extension muscles.
That's right.
So
They
squats,
straighten the knee.
lunges,
Yeah.
anything like sitting to standing,
Right, exactly. Yep, your
chair
big thigh
pose.
muscles. Yeah, exactly. Chair pose. A lot of yoga poses, like standing yoga poses, tend to be very quad, focused on the
Right.
front leg, on the front
Yeah.
leg.
So you're getting a lot of VMO work. You just didn't know it.
Yeah,
But not
exactly.
just VMO work, as we'll explain.
Right. So the reason that we're pulling this muscle out to focus on is because it is a muscle that historically has been very much blamed for knee pain, and specifically a type of knee pain, patellofemoral pain. PFP. And just to break that down anatomically, in case those words sound like, what does that mean? Your patella is your kneecap, and then femoral for your femur, which is your thigh bone. So it's basically like pain at the front of the knee. Would you say, Travis? That's what patellofemoral knee pain is. And that's
Hmm.
related to the quadriceps because all 4 quadriceps are on the front thigh, but then they converge down and they like engulf the kneecap and then they converge into a single tendon that attaches on the front of your shin.
Hmm.
So they're super relevant for the kneecap, basically, and any pain that you might have around the knee. So
Agreed.
historically, yeah, historically, patellofemoral pain or that front knee pain has been blamed, or a big culprit for that pain has thought to have been specifically the vastus medialis obliquus, the VMO. So technically, the muscle itself is just the vastus medialis, but it has 2 parts, a higher part and a lower part. And it's specifically this lower part that's the VMO, the vastus medialis obliquus. And the upper part of the muscle is like the longest, the vastus medialis longus, just to be extra anatomy geeky about this. And I think a lot of people will recognize, Travis, like the teardrop of the quadricep, the teardrop.
I know it well.
When people have like defined quads, right? They often have
Hmm.
that tear. And I
Yes,
think people can probably think
it's a
about that.
desirable look for
Exactly.
some.
Yes. Aesthetically. Yeah. Right. So like that, right where that teardrop is, which is usually like kind of on the inner knee, on the lower thigh, that's basically the VMO. That's like kind of where that is. So basically, knee pain, a lot of knee pain had been blamed on the VMO and basically like a timing issue or a strength issue. It's usually one or the other or both.
Or
And the idea,
tracking,
yeah, yeah, that's what I was
but
just going to
they're
say was that
intertwined.
because the idea is that the VMO either and or has like a slight delay in firing or like timing, like a matter of milliseconds, or that it's weaker relative to the vastus lateralis, which is like the other quad on the other side. So the idea is that that creates this imbalance either in timing or in strength, and that pulls the kneecap off track and creates that kneecap tracking issue. I bet people have heard of this like kneecap tracking. I feel like that's kind of a buzz term, right?
Hmm.
So the idea is
Hmm.
that yeah, you have VMO problems and that's causing kneecap tracking problems and that's what's causing your knee pain. You have heard about this before, right?
Yes, for sure.
And do you know what historically had been like prescribed to treat that knee pain?
Yeah, VMO isolation.
That's
Let's
right,
find
Travis.
exercises where we can isolate the VMO independent of the other quads that are already fine or over,
Assumed to be
yeah,
fine.
better developed compared to our underdeveloped VMO. And then we can
Mhm.
specifically target the VMO to correct our timing or strength imbalance and
That's right.
therefore correct our kneecap tracking and fix our patellofemoral pain syndrome.
Yes, and this is the old paradigm that's still totally kicking around out there, but that's it. And
Hmm.
like examples of VMO exercises, like where you're trying to isolate to somehow correct the timing or increase the strength. One example of that is like say you're sitting with your legs straight out in front of you, like in yoga, dandasana, and then you externally rotate the leg of the knee of interest. So you turn your toes out and then you lift and lower that leg. That's one example of like that's supposed to like isolate the VMO. Or you could do something like a wall squat or a wall sit with like a ball between your knees and then you squeeze into the ball. These are just some kind of classic physical therapy exercises for like isolating the VMO. So that's historically what's been done. But we actually know now from, and this, like you said, this is kind of an old story, and so it's been outdated for a while now. But what we know is that just general exercise, especially for like the knee and the hip, just general, not like this hyper specific focused on the VMO, but general knee and hip exercise are actually really the evidence based approach for addressing knee pain, and they work just as well, if not better, than these like VMO specific approaches. And we have a lot
Well,
of
why is
research
that?
that shows that. Well, so the VMO approaches did work. Like people did feel better with
Yeah.
that, but it's just like they also feel better from just general exercise. And so when you say why is that, I think it's probably just because the mediating variable you might say is just like graded loading, just getting people
Hmm.
moving and slowly increasing load over time, whether that's with these specific VMO exercises or just general squats and lunges and whatever you're going to do in general to load these
Right.
areas.
But then also just the idea of is or are those specific VMO isolation exercises actually isolating the VMO? And is that even neuromuscularly possible or
Possible.
plausible?
Such a good question. And it turns out, Travis, that it's not possible. It's not
What?
possible to isolate the VMO. Yeah, and we have like a lot of research to show this. There's only one nerve that innervates all of the quadriceps, the femoral nerve, and they all fire together. And you can't, like, it's not possible to just fire your VMO. Like, you can't do it. So it's just like it's like an illusion to think that you could isolate it. And then another illusion, I thought this one was really cool to learn about when I was researching this, is that the assumption had often been that your VMO was like underdeveloped, like when you have this knee
Mm-hmm.
pain. Or another word for that
Mm.
is atrophied. Atrophied, that's like muscle atrophy. But we
Mm.
actually have research that looked into this, and it found that when people have patellofemoral pain, all four of the quadricep muscles are all atrophied to an equal extent. All of them are. It's
Mm.
just that because the VMO is like that prominent teardrop muscle, it's a little more obvious to our eye. So we might
Mm.
see it and be like, oh, that looks, like it's smaller or whatever, because it just
Right.
stands out to us more. But really, all of them can atrophy when people have knee pain, all of them together. So it's not that it happens in an isolated
Yeah.
manner anyway.
And then
Right?
the last nail in the coffin
What's the last nail?
is that when you do those VMO exercises, you're and you get better, your patellar tracking doesn't change, right?
Thank you for saying that. Yes, and we have research to show that as well.
Yeah,
People
which is
get out
not
of, yeah,
super surprising if you
right.
know, like there are a bunch of examples of people getting better from interventions that were thought to do something specific from a nitty-gritty biomechanical standpoint, and nothing
Yeah,
changed when they remeasure those biomechanics, but they feel better. So it wasn't the
right.
explanation that we once thought, which lends itself to the idea that maybe you don't need to do these specific VMO exercises because that didn't actually change what you thought it was changing. And what the reason you got better is the more general effects of exercise.
That's right. Of exercise, which that works in so many levels and in so many
Right.
ways. It's, yeah. Yeah, and that's probably why those VMO programs to treat this pain, to the extent that they do work, that's probably why they work. It's not because of the specific exercise, it's just because it was movement and exercise, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the kneecap tracking doesn't change after them anyway, and you can't isolate view. I mean, you can see how many holes there are with this approach. It's like kind of a long laundry list, and it's a very obvious one, I think, that has really been exposed through research. Although
Yeah, but people are still talking about it, so
when I did my
not
research for
not obvious
this
enough.
episode, I saw tons on Google about like VMO exercise. Like it's like you said, it's
Yeah.
totally out there. But hopefully, through like this education on this episode, hopefully, maybe a few people will think twice about those claims if they see them.
Yeah.
So that's VMO, and we wanted to point it out because it's an example. We think it's an example of a magic muscle. It's
Oh yeah.
mostly relevant, more like in a rehab context. I would say, like that whole conversation we just had is maybe a little more rehab based than like yoga movement or even strength training. But still, it's just helpful for us to look at. Like
Mm-hmm.
when do these muscles really matter in the way that we hear them discussed?
Right. And our replacement magic muscle for this can be all of the knee extension, well, all of the knee and hip muscles.
Exactly. That's right, Travis. Yes. So instead of the magic muscle of this single, it's not even one muscle, it's one part of one muscle. It's the
Right.
VMO, like the lower part. Instead of just getting so hyper specific, it could just be all of them
Yeah,
in
either
the
all the
region.
quads or but the recommendation is general knee and hip strengthening. So,
That's the current official position on
yeah.
that knee pain. Yeah. Just generally strengthen the knee and the hip, which is great. That's like, that means we have so many more options. It means we don't have to be so specific, and that's a good thing. That like frees us up, right?
I think so.
What's our next? What's our next magic muscle on our list to take a look at
Our
today?
next one is the transverse abdominis,
Woohoo!
which we've
Uh,
talked about before. Yes, no, maybe
we
so.
have Travis, and that's why I was
Not
going to suggest
specifically.
maybe we won't talk about it a ton today because we have addressed it on the
Sure.
podcast before. We talked about it in our episode on the core, which I
Okay.
think is called "The Truth About Core Training," and it might be episode 4 or something. So we did talk about it then. So maybe we don't have to talk about it a ton here, but it is a magic muscle. How do you see it pulled out as a magic muscle? Like what makes it a magic muscle?
Pilates. No.
The whole field of Pilates.
Just yeah.
Yeah.
That's all. No, the cueing about, well, it's commonly cited as the cause, dun, dun, dun,
Yeah.
for back pain, and then
Right.
the fix is activating the TA for all your core and really just like all the time, everywhere, walk around
Mm-hmm.
belly button to spine, but like drawing your navel in,
Yeah.
or abdominal hollowing. That's the other
Yeah. That's
term
another
for it, right?
term. Yeah.
Um, so yeah, the thought process is that the TVA is not firing, or not firing in the appropriate timing or sequence relative to
Mm-hmm.
the other core muscles, or any muscle. I forget what that early research said, but or what
Oh,
like what the
right.
task was. But the
I
point
think it
is
was
that,
like an arm reach or something
yeah,
with the limbs moving.
yeah,
Yeah.
the idea is like your TVA in healthy individuals was firing a few milliseconds earlier
Yeah.
than the people with back pain. So therefore, people with back pain have a TVA timing issue that they need to do a bunch of motor control exercises to fix. Um, so there are many flaws in that argument. The first being the
Yes.
magnitude of the timing issue, but the second just then being that we need to fix this timing, so we need to do all of these exercises with this extra navel to spine focus,
Yeah.
and that's going to cure our back pain.
That's right. That's right. That early research that showed this correlation between people with back pain and that tiny millisecond delay in the firing of
Yeah,
that muscle,
Hodges,
which,
right?
yeah, Paul Hodges, yeah. But Travis, isn't
19 something.
98 or something? Long time ago.
That sounds good. Yeah.
Isn't even just the so he did some research that did show this connection. But is that
Hmm.
necessarily did that necessarily mean that their TVA tiny delay was causing their back pain? Did it show that,
Could
Travis?
if no, because it was cross sectional, right? So it could have been
Mhm.
that the people who had pain, their pain inhibited their, or
Mhm.
not inhibited, but altered the timing of those muscles, rather than the muscular timing preceding and then
That's right.
causing the pain.
That's right. Like, yeah, the research didn't show us either way. Like, it didn't say there was a causal connection, but it was just extrapolated to mean that by a bunch of people, and
Obvious,
then
it's
like
obvious, right?
right, right. And then
And
Pilates
then
was born and just like the whole
no,
fields of core stability. And I
yeah,
know it's not
Pilates was
just
around a
Pilates,
lot
but
before that, right?
oh, that's true. You're totally right. It was. It wasn't born, but just the idea of core stability, and that's really big in Pilates in general.
Hmm.
But yeah, this idea that like navel to spine or similar cueing activates the transverse abdominus, and just generally, like you said, Travis, in an indiscriminate manner, it's kind of assumed that we just all need to do that. Like we all need
Hmm.
to correct
All the
our
time.
TBA. Yeah. Yeah. So clear. So the assumptions were made that aren't really supported that the TVA delay in firing caused back pain. But then I think there's also this assumption just that we also just need to engage it in order to prevent back pain, right? It's kind of like two
Mm-hmm.
ways.
Mm-hmm.
That's at least how I often see it treated in like a yoga movement context, It's like to
Mm-hmm.
keep your back safe or protected, you need to draw your navel
Right.
in.
Oh man,
So yeah, there's a
so
lot there.
silly.
Yeah. It is, right? But I mean, it seems silly, but it is still super widespread out there
Yeah.
in general. But Travis, are our spines, I guess this is a good question. Are our spines inherently unstable structures to begin with? Like, is it something we need to be
Like
concerned with?
if we aren't activating our TVA, are we just gonna fall apart?
Yes, like a stack of blocks, will they just
Right.
crumple? Our spinal
Uh
column?
yeah, I don't think so. I think the spine is more robust,
That's
more
right.
stable naturally, without us even having to think about drawing our belly buttons in. As if that even created more stability to begin
As if it
with.
even so does drawing the navel in even create more
No,
stability?
no,
Why not?
it there's research that
There's
shows
research,
that
yeah. It's
there's
less
there's a
stable.
there's a better way. If the goal is to create stability, which should be task specific, not just, oh, I need to make sure my spine is stable when I'm walking around or picking up a pencil.
Yeah.
But if you want to create more stability through because the activity that you're about to do demands it, such as lifting a heavy object,
Mhm.
then the way that you want to do that is not through navel to spine, but rather through co-contracting all of the muscles generally. So
Mhm.
no magic muscle here, but trying to create
Right.
rigidity through the entire torso or midsection, which is called an abdominal brace.
It's called a brace. Exact, and that's different than navel to spine, which is, yeah, different than like Halloween or whatever. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
research actually shows that the navel to spine is less stable for the spine than a brace, which, like you said, it's global engagement of all of the muscles around the trunk. And that's a strategy you might utilize if it was like heavy weightlifting or something.
Mm-hmm.
The
Mm-hmm.
brace would be, but
Yeah,
it's
which
like,
really doesn't pop up in yoga.
yeah, yes, like back squatting
So
hundreds of
yeah,
pounds or
mm, I mean, can you think of an example of a yoga pose where it's important to volitionally brace, like as you're getting into or
That's a
maintaining?
great question, and off the top of my head, no.
Yeah. No,
Although
I
I
mean,
think in
the only thing that comes to mind is like handstand. Like that's legitimately that's a high load. You're supporting your hands upside or your body weight upside down, right? But even there,
yeah,
like I don't necessarily you want to, you know, if you want to get a nice line, like a
yes,
nice
like
shape
aesthetic
in
line.
space, yeah, then there's some contraction of abs and glutes that has to happen, but it's not really
Yeah, and also
bracing.
too, like in handstand, I try to really reach up through my legs, which would mean like I'm engaging the quads. Like it's just kind of from head to toe. For me, everything is
Hmm.
like kind of trying to be
Yeah,
tensed,
yeah,
which would
yeah.
include the
It's not a
core.
hollow.
Yeah, for me, it wouldn't be. Yeah, yeah. I would. One thing I was going to suggest, and I don't know, but I mean, if someone maybe had like sensitivity in their back, and they were going to go into a certain yoga pose that involved a certain range of motion, maybe they could experiment with like
Sure.
volitionally creating a core contraction, and maybe that would help modulate some, sensitivity, like
Yeah,
in
that's
terms of
like
like
a case
pain.
by case.
But
Yeah.
it's case by case, exactly,
Hmm.
not just like a
Yeah, not
general
like
like
everybody in the room. Draw your belly
yes,
button in and then do, I don't know. What would be a pose where you'd be told to draw your belly button in?
all the
All
time
of them.
in many yoga
Yeah,
classes, all the time.
Tadasana.
But
Yeah,
yeah, for sure. In certain, it depends on who the teacher is. But like back bends for sure. I mean, there's just many, many
that'd be
poses,
hard. That'd
arm
be hard to do.
balances. Yeah, in a back bend.
Yeah, I got enough to worry
Right.
about in a back bend without
Yeah,
trying to
exactly.
draw my navel in a spine.
So I think that's the main point. There's actually a lot more we could probably say about TVA, and we did say a lot more in
Hmm.
episode, I believe it's 4, all about the core training episode. So we'll refer people there. But like the point is, we wanted to just highlight this muscle because, in my opinion, it's one of the biggest magic muscles out there, at least from what I
Yeah,
see in my what I tend to see out there. And the point
right.
is, for most cases, and especially in a generic yoga movement context, we don't need to be pulling that muscle out and making it a magic
Yeah,
or extra important muscle, right? We
right.
just could kind of
Maybe
let that go.
before we move on, maybe we should have said what the TVA is anatomically.
You're totally right, Travis. Yes, sorry we didn't do that in the beginning. What is the TVA?
It's like the corset muscle, right? That kind of
Yeah, around
wraps
your
around.
abdomen.
Yeah. So
That's right.
contracting it does draw in.
Kind of hugs in.
Drawing in contracts it.
That's right. Oh, but we should point out drawing in or navel to spine does contract it, but not in isolation.
Hmm.
It
Right.
also
Yeah.
contracts
Which
other
is
muscles at the
even
same time.
funnier because you think that
Yeah.
you're isolating the TVA, but you're actually contracting all of the other muscles around
Yeah,
it.
other abdominals, your pelvic floor, your diaphragm, multifid, like a bunch more contracts when you do
That's a
navel to spine than
that's a
just
common theme.
right, that you can't isolate muscles
Yeah,
volitionally.
well, right, right. So, like all the muscles we've talked about so far, you think that you're like whether you're attempting to strengthen it or you're attempting to apply external pressure to it, like self massage,
Oh, right.
especially with these deeper muscles, you're not even well with the contraction. Other muscles are contracting. With the self massage, if it's a deeper muscle, you're not even getting to it anyway.
Yeah, totally. Which like the psoas, which is on our list. to talk
which is, yeah,
about.
right.
Should we just jump to and cover the psoas quickly? Because
Yeah,
it
while we're
seems
on it.
relevant for what you were just saying. It wasn't like in our
Mm-hmm.
order to do now, but let's. And psoas, we've also talked about this on the podcast before. So again, I don't think we'll spend too much time discussing the psoas, but I'm sure many of our listeners can relate to having heard of this as a buzz term muscle. What's the psoas, Travis?
The psoas is a deep hip flexor,
Yeah,
often or off, yeah, sometimes are often lumped together with the iliacus
that's right.
to be called the iliopsoas. But it seems like in yoga, more people just talk about it
Talk about
separately
the
as the psoas
psoas.
because it's so magical.
It's so magical. Yeah. Yeah,
um,
I rarely hear talk about the iliacus. I mean, it's out there,
yeah,
but it's much more
yeah.
just like the psoas.
But the iliacus, I think, does the same thing.
As
It
far as
like
hip flexion,
flexes the,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah, because the psoas and the iliacus, they converge in a common tendon,
Mm,
distally, but superiorly or up higher, they're different because the iliacus only goes from your pelvis down to your femur. It only crosses the hip joint. But the psoas actually it attaches to this at the same place that the iliacus does, but it runs a lot higher and it's like kind of knitted into the side of your lumbar spine, your low back, basically. So it like attaches to the
mm.
vertebral bodies of T12 to L5. I think these are naming vertebrae, and then also
Okay, so
attaches to the
that's why.
transverse processes of L1 to L5. So it's yeah, it's connected through the lumbar spine, and then it runs down and crosses your hip.
That's why it's more magical.
Exactly.
Because it cross
That's
the more joints it crosses, the more magical it is.
interesting. That's the case with this one for sure. With this magic
No,
muscle.
yeah.
But yeah, one thing it does have in common with some other magic muscles we've talked about, and maybe we'll get to also, is that it's deep. And you were just talking about this
Mhm.
before we. And this is something I was going to suggest. As far as one thing I think sometimes unifies a lot of these magic muscles is that for some reason it's just kind of assumed that when a muscle is deeper, it must be more magical, like,
Yeah,
there's something about it, than the superficial muscles.
yeah.
Oh, those are that's not as interesting.
Because its role supposedly, and I think this has maybe also been overstated, but it's more of a stabilizer.
Yeah, and I also see that, like, I think it's a little unknown, kinda like with the QL, a lot of people assume what it does, but actually it's not really known. I think it's a
Hmm.
little uncertain if it does lumbar spine stabilizations, but I do see it said in studies that the psoas does do that. It does stabilize the
Yeah,
lumbar
or
spine.
any of the magic muscles, like in conjunction with them being deeper. The
Mhm.
reason maybe they're deeper is because they have more stabilizing roles, and then when stability gets involved in the definition, that there's all sorts of magic that
You're
ensues,
so right. But
especially from
Travis,
a
did
rehab standpoint.
did you know that oh, right, especially from a rehab point or perspective, but did you know that going back to our discussion about the core and the transverse abdominis, that's a deep muscle and it's called a
Hmm.
stabilizer, but as you already described, with the bracing strategy for stabilization, which that's the actual research supported means of creating stabilization. That's global muscle recruitment all the way around the trunk, including deep and superficial,
Right.
like all of it. And the
Hmm.
point
Hmm.
being that sometimes we do hear that the deeper muscles are called stabilizers and the superficial ones are called movers, but I believe that that's like a false dichotomy, and
Yeah.
that actually your nervous system just will recruit either superficial or it doesn't really matter. It's just like depends on the task. Like, what are you doing? How are you moving? And then a certain muscle
Right.
may be a stabilizer, it may be a mover. It just depends on the task.
Yeah, that's my understanding of it too, as compared to like people talking about the inner and outer core, right? Like, oh, the
Yes.
outer core moves, the inner core stabilizes. It's
It
like,
doesn't
that's
though. I think that's a
probably
false
probably not.
dichotomy.
Yeah,
Or
probably
at
not that
least an
simple.
oversimplification.
Right.
And I don't know, but in our common everyday language, when something is deep, it's like extra special or extra
We
meaningful,
can't
like
see it
that's
as easily, so it's more
it's
magical.
it's more mysterious, more magical.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And so that I really do think there's something about just our bias and the way our brains work. But when a muscle is deep, we kind of automatically jump to like, it's got to be more special. But it doesn't actually when it comes to your nervous system and how it coordinates your movement. It's just like all the muscles are equal. But anyway, the psoas is
Muscle
deep.
equality. That's
Yeah.
the
That's right.
The
You're
bottom line.
so funny. Yeah, that's right.
Equality for all 639.
They're all equal rights. But I'm okay. So psoas, everybody knows that's a magic muscle. It's
Mm-hmm.
discussed in terms of it's supposedly a cause of back pain for sure. Like a quote
Mm-hmm.
tight psoas causes back pain. And then we've talked about this a few times on the podcast. It's also held up as a magic muscle because it's claimed to store your emotions and your trauma and your stress. Just like all of that is supposedly deposited in the psoas. I
Mm-hmm.
don't. We don't have time to, and we've discussed this before. We can refer people to episode 9, maybe. Do we store emotions in our hips? I think it's
Mm-hmm.
episode 9, but anyway, go check out that one for
That was a
a
doozy.
richer discussion. Yeah, yeah. There are a lot of problems with that, with those claims. It's not evidence-based or research-based at all. It's more just like a story or kind of like a myth around the psoas, but it's not anything that the science actually supports, that the psoas like holds emotions or
Yeah,
trauma.
it's a cute story.
It's a nice story. Stories are great, but when you try to then say that they're scientific, that's where I see a problem with that.
That's where you draw the line.
Yes. I have this graphic that I've posted on social media a few times over the years.
Mm-hmm.
Or it's just a graphic that says the psoas just as special as all 600 muscles of the body.
And
That's what it says. And then it just talks about what we're kind of talking about right now, like how it's held
then the
out
people
as.
people in the comments are like, "No,
I know, but
Jenni, that
actually
can't be
it's
true. It's the
exactly.
most important.
It's just as
How dare
special
you?"
as all 600 other muscles. Like we don't need to pull it out and make it more magical. Um, it's a hip flexor. It's probably a lumbar spine stabilizer. That's what it does. Like all the muscles that do stuff, they move, they stabilize. It's just like all the other muscles that way. And yeah, listen to the other episode for more of a conversation about that. Well, we had a couple more muscles on our list. We knew we were not really going to talk about the glutes, but we did want to just
Mm-hmm.
mention them. Like that's a very popular magic muscle. We did a whole entire episode on the glutes in which we really
Mm-hmm.
delved into it. So we will probably refer people to that episode, right?
Mm-hmm.
But we even talk in
And
that
that's
episode about.
our one counterexample of the like a pretty big and superficial muscle
You're totally
that's
right.
magic.
Exactly. It's a magical muscle that's not deep. It's
Yeah,
like one
but
of the
we're not going to
few.
talk about it on this
No,
episode
we're not
because
going to
it
talk about.
doesn't fit our bias. The rest of them are deep. No,
That's
we're not
right.
talking about it because we already have gone through it in painstaking detail.
In our other episode, but we wanted to include it so that yeah, so it's like it is one of those magic muscles. And another one that I don't think we will talk about today is the piriformis. We talked about this one in our episode on pigeon pose, so we actually have also
Right.
covered this one. But
Yes.
it's a deep it's a deep hip
Mm-hmm.
rotator. So it's like one of your deep hip muscles. So it does kind of fall in that pattern of a lot of magic muscles being deep. It's commonly blamed for the cause of a lot of pain, and commonly a target, like to intervene when there's pain or if you want to prevent pain or blah blah blah. But as we talked about in the other episode, it's kind of pulled out and highlighted as a magic muscle that's actually not really warranted by what the science would suggest. Yeah, so we can refer people to that episode. But I do think this thinking about the piriformis does bring up one thing I did want to make sure we mentioned today, which was that in a rehab physical therapy context, we've talked about this on the podcast before, Travis, but would you agree that there's a trend toward diagnoses becoming much more general and less
Mm-hmm.
specific? Right? Like
Yes.
that's kind of a trend in the field in general, as like seeing these overall insights from research on all these like specific parts of the body that
Mm-hmm. That's why
make
I thought maybe patellofemoral pain syndrome, they weren't even calling that anymore, but maybe they still are. But I know like rotator cuff or shoulder impingement, they're now calling rotator cuff related pain or something like
shoulder
that.
pain, rotator cuff related shoulder pain. That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they don't call it
And I'm sure
impingement
there
syndrome
are other
anymore because that's too
examples.
specific.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, in the with the piriformis, something that used to be called quote piriformis syndrome, it's not called that anymore. It's just called deep gluteal syndrome, because the main point
Mm.
is like there are many tissues and structures in the hip that could be involved in what's going on. Of course, also just so much else from like the psychosocial realm and just systemic. Like it's just so much more than just that.
Yeah.
But
So it's more about the
um
region.
it's the region. Yeah, it's like you have pain in the deep gluteal. You have pain in your
Hmm.
shoulder or the rotator cuff area. Like we use these terms. These terms are being brought into like the common
Yeah.
diagnoses now that are just more general.
I guess patellofemoral pain is already general because it's not
That's right, Travis.
implicating a specific muscle or
It's an
structure.
area.
It's just like that spot that hurts,
That's
which is
exactly
like
it.
maybe for some people that's like a frustrating uh, situation. It's like I just want to know what's wrong, and it's like, well, it's generally that area of the body. But I kind of find it to be encouraging because I think it also lends itself to the idea that there can be a general approach to treatment.
Yes, 100%. Yeah, and that's why I think you were kind of getting caught up on like that can't be the real
That's right, because
diagnose, like the
it's
current
already been that.
diagnosis.
Yeah,
Yeah, but it's because it's just catch-all. It's just like you have pain at the front of your knee. We're
yeah.
not
I
naming,
When I first found out about that, I was like, that's kind of a silly uh, name for a condition that doesn't mean anything. But
but
now,
yeah,
like you said, we're moving towards more naming conventions that also similarly don't mean that much, but for a
exactly.
reason,
Right,
because
for a good
we
yes.
can't we are discovering that we can't be as specific as we once thought, which goes back to all of what we've been talking about from an
100%.
overspecification, an anatomical overspecification standpoint.
Precisely. So just the whole reason or kind of the whole part of this message of magic muscles is just like they're examples of being very specific about anatomy. And there may be some contexts where that does seem helpful, but in many contexts it's probably not the best strategy. And we don't really know what's really going on this specific tissue structure level. It's probably more evidence-based to just be more generic and less specific. Another good diagnosis along these lines is non-specific low back pain. Don't you think that's like
There's
another
right. It's
example?
right in the name of it. Non-specific.
Exactly.
That's
Right. Like
perfect.
that's yeah, it's like they don't really know what structure or tissue is causing. And again, even saying that is like assuming it's a tissue or structure
Right.
and it may not be. But
Hmm.
instead it's more just like, yeah, you have pain in this region of the low back and it's non-specific and that's what we're going to call it. It's kind
Hmm.
of the same as patellofemoral and all the others. So it does seem like the evidence-based physical therapy circles that are keeping up with the current research, like that's the trend is like let's just be more many cases. I know that there are some painful conditions where being specific, like maybe with a tendinopathy or something, like there are some
Yeah.
cases where being specific does matter, but in
Hmm.
many persistent pain conditions, it's like what makes sense is to just be general, right?
Hmm.
Yeah. So, Travis, I kind of think we've thoroughly gone through this list. This was 7 magic muscles that we wanted to at least name. I know we didn't really discuss all of them,
Hmm.
but we did discuss most of them. And then just the general overall concept of magic muscles and what it might suggest to us as far as like how we do or don't use muscles or kind of come from that approach in maybe the movement modality that we practice or teach.
Right. And there's a rumor that you may have covered these in even more depth and detail in
That's
another
true.
location.
Yes. I did actually kind of in conjunction with preparing for this episode, I also sorry, there was like a noise here.
Yeah,
Did you hear that? Or
I
maybe
did.
okay.
Like your email.
Yeah, my email. I thought that it didn't make a noise, but anyway, sorry, it did anyway.
Now we know.
Yeah. Um I prepared a whole course, a continuing education course for my website that is on this topic, but a much expanded, an expanded version of this. And so we go into more depth in the muscles, and then we also talk about other tissues and just this general taking a look at like how does the nervous system actually coordinate movement? Does it even coordinate movement on the whole muscle level anyway? Like how does that happen? And so just like reasons, just taking a deeper look at how we choose to cue movement, and whether we need to be so anatomically specific, you know?
That
And
sounds
the
like a lot of
name,
fun.
yeah, it is. I'm really excited about the course. So it's a continuing ed course. Anyone can take it. If you're a Yoga Alliance registered yoga teacher, it counts for continuing education credit toward that. So that could be
Hmm.
really nice. And
You can take it for
it's
free
on,
too, right?
you can, Travis, because all the memberships on my site start with a 7-day free trial. So you can take this course for free. You can learn a lot more than what we dove into in this episode. And it's just really good, I think, information for any body geek, yoga geek, and especially yoga teachers who are, leading people through movement. So it's on my website. Anyone can take it anytime. It's called When Should We Be Anatomically Specific in Yoga? It's a brand new course. I'm excited about it.
What an awesome course.
Thank you. And so, with all of that said, do you think that we've kind of completed what we wanted to cover today?
I think we nailed it.
Me too. Thanks so much for being here and talking to me about all this.
Thanks for all the awesome knowledge.